Hi, I'm Jameel Smith, in for my MTV News colleague Anna Marie Cox. This is Friends Like These, a podcast about difficult conversations. Since I'm talking from my home state of Ohio, I thought I'd keep this show local. We won't be talking all about Ohio, but both of my guests are friends and fellow Buckeyes. I'll start with my conversation with Wesley Lowry, who went to Shaker Heights High School in suburban Cleveland, same as me. Wes is a national reporter for the Washington Post, and he covers law enforcement, justice, race, and politics. He's the author of They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement. It was his idea that in 2015 sparked his newspaper to start tabulating the number of police killings, a job the government wasn't doing. That reporting won the Post a Pulitzer Prize. They're still counting, and as of today, St. Patrick's Day, 219 people have been shot and killed by police in America. Why does it feel like we know none of their names? I talked to Wesley about that, and also his recent reporting. Wes, this past week you had two really interesting reports. The first was about a documentary that included previously unreleased video footage of Michael Brown on the day that he died, and is also about the policeman who killed him, Darren Wilson. Let's start with the tape. What does it show, and why does it matter?
So this tape, which had been previously unreleased, shows a new interaction between Michael Brown and Ferguson Market and Liquor, right? So this is the liquor store that in the video we had seen previously, he allegedly robs in the moments before the shooting, right? Now, this was a video from a few hours earlier where apparently in the early morning or the late night from the night before, around 1:13 in the morning, Michael Brown goes into that same liquor store previously and has some type of interaction with the clerks, right? The filmmaker, Jason Pollock, alleges that this new video shows that Michael Brown was trading them weeds for cigarillos and that he left his cigarillos there. What the prosecutor is saying, and what the liquor store is saying, is that no, that's not what this video shows. Rather, what this video shows is Michael Brown attempting to barter and them essentially telling him to get lost, and that perhaps that's why he came back upset the next day, is their argument. So at the end of the day, kind of the upshot is there was additional video we had not seen. Prosecutors say that it's not particularly relevant to the shooting itself, and that it was framed in a way that was unfair. Other people are saying that this really starts to undo the narrative. But we don't really know. I mean, my take on this is I think that it does seem less significant than it was originally framed to be. But the reality is it is kind of shocking and surprising that there would be any new evidence that we had not seen previously. The idea or the existence of a Michael Brown video that we have not seen and that is just coming to light in 2017 does speak to the concerns a lot of people have always had about this investigation. Were the powers that be locally being forthcoming? What were they doing with information? Were they selectively releasing some and not releasing all of it? This only serves to kind of underscore some of those fears.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I had two thoughts really on this. Number one is, why didn't we see this before? And number two is why we're seeing this at a documentary that premieres at South by Southwest. You know what I mean? Like what? Like it just seems like an interesting forum to debut that particular piece of information. Not in a courtroom, not say on the local news, not in a on a newspaper or website. No, it's in a documentary that shows in a conference that most people can't afford to attend. What I just don't even understand sometimes what to do with material like this when it surfaces, because it's just about the criminality of Michael Brown, who didn't really commit a crime here. He was the victim, as one way or another. If you feel like he, deserved to be killed by Darren Wilson, or if you feel like he if you feel like he wasn't deserving of that, he was the victim. Why are we debating his criminality?
Of course. Well, and I think that was so much of it. Now, part of it is important, right? Because what people try to frame, or the discussion that the people attempt to have, is essentially, does the liquor store robbery somehow explain Michael Brown's mindset in the moment? If you can prove that somehow he is kind of unpredictably violent, then that would help explain Darren Wilson's story. Because, remember, a lot of Darren Wilson's story relies on this idea that Michael Brown, after having been shot, turned around and charged him again. Right. And that's something that I think for a lot of people doesn't pass the smell test. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. And so therefore, the idea is if you can frame Michael Brown as someone who is kind of unpredictably violent or predisposed to some type of violence like this, it would begin to theoretically explain why he might do the otherwise, this thing that otherwise seems unrealistic.
Right. Now, Darren Wilson, speaking of him, you had a report later on in the week about how that former Ferguson police officer testified that he actually had used the word nigger before. And I found it curious how he qualified that. Can you go into detail a little bit more about that?
Sure. So essentially what happened was after the video, myself and I'm sure some other reporters started looking back at the civil lawsuit that's still ongoing. And it's actually interesting that the civil case is still ongoing. This is one of the only major cases where there has not been a settlement, right? Tamir Rice's family has gotten a settlement. Eric Gardner's family has got a settlement. Freddie Gray, Walter Scott, right? The city of Ferguson, however, is really fighting Michael Brown's family in this wrongful death suit. But so in this suit, as it's playing forward, it's producing new documents. And one document that had kind of been quietly filed that people didn't notice was that Darren Wilson had submitted a series of admissions, right? Now, what admissions are is you're essentially trying to drill into what things do we all kind of already agree on so we don't have to debate them in court. What can we just establish as fact? And so the attorneys for Michael Brown's family send him a list of, 170 or so kind of definitive statements, right?
Right.
And he either admits that he agrees that is true or he denies it. And so this was interesting in part because we have very little from Darren Wilson. He's done one interview with George Stephanopoulos, or two interviews, one with George Stephanopoulos and one with the New Yorker, and then we have his grand jury transcript, but otherwise we've never heard from him. And so anytime he's speaking, especially speaking under oath, it's important to kind of look at, is it consistent with what he said previously? Is there any new tidbits of information? So as I'm looking at this, I largely thought that his admissions lined up with his version of the story previously, but what was new in here was that the attorneys asked him specifically, they asked him, have you ever used the N-word? Have you ever said racist remarks or heard other officers saying racist remarks? And what he says in these admissions is that yes, he's used the N-word before to describe black people. However, he clarifies, but I've only done it when I was repeating what someone else told me in the course of an investigation, right? So the idea that he's interviewing two people and someone says, well, that nigger did X, Y, and Z, and then he repeats it back or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So he says that. However, he does not issue that same qualification when he answers that yes, he has heard his fellow officers using the N-word, and he's heard his fellow officers making racist remarks, right? And so that it was just interesting. It's hard because we don't have the full context on it, and his attorneys would insist probably that no, he only did any of these things in the context of investigations. But, that he would admit that under oath, I think was very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it seemed like he was trying to say, hey, all these other guys are racist. I'm just repeating it in the context of testifying or, giving witness to whatever they may have said. But it just seemed like, I don't know, it just seemed like he was trying to really make sure that we didn't think he was racist, which seems to be like the foremost priority for white cops when they testify about killings like this. There's another report that came out about this Darren Wilson admittance that got a lot of people hyped. And I saw you debunking some of this. Can you go into detail about what that was? Because I feel like there's a lot of speculation around this admittance that kind of got a little bit out of control.
Yeah, so this is obviously a very emotional case that people still feel very strongly about, an extremely polarizing case, right? There are very few people who exist in any middle on this. Most people either believe that Darren Wilson was completely in the right or that Michael Brown was murdered, senselessly. There's very few people who exist somewhere between that. But with this new document, what happened the day after I reported it was there was a report in The Root, which I like. I know a lot of people over there, and I like this writer typically as well. But there's this report in The Root that essentially argued that between the new video as well as this new document, that basically everything you thought you knew about what happened with Michael Brown was wrong. And what he asserted in this piece was that this new admission sheet showed that Darren Wilson was admitting that Michael Brown had never reached for his gun. Now, there's a line in the admissions where Darren Wilson is asked, is it true that Michael Brown never attempted to unholster your gun, right? And Darren Wilson says, yes, that's true. He never attempted to unholster it. And so people kind of ran with this saying, see, Michael Brown never reached for the gun. This was a lie the whole time. But what was key here was that Darren Wilson's story, even though the media sometimes presented it as such, Darren Wilson's story was never that Michael Brown attempted to take Darren Wilson's gun unprompted out of his holster. The story, according to Darren Wilson, and in his grand jury testimony in 2014, was that Michael Brown punched him. And so he drew his own gun, pointed it at Michael Brown, and then Michael Brown grabbed the gun, right? And so it would be able to be consistent that Darren Wilson could say, no, Michael Brown never attempted to unholster my gun, but he also attempted to grab it and did grab it at some point, right? Mm-hmm. And so that is the kind of distinction here. It's difficult because these are, especially these admissions, which are not narrative documents, they're literally just a series of statements, yes, no, yes, no. Just because something isn't asked about doesn't mean it doesn't exist. You're not responding with any big clarifications. Sometimes you can add a word or two or a sentence, but you're not crafting the whole story. It's really important that, we're really careful with what we say that the document says and does not say, right? Because there's much more that's not in it than that is in it.
Right. So I had this weird feeling when I read your report and I read even that root item that it was just interesting to see police brutality in the news again. Like, I just feel like it hasn't been something that, in 2015, going basically dating back to Michael Brown's death, 2014, 2015, 2016 to a certain extent. And now 2017, I mean, that post database that you guys have has 219 killings as of today, St. Patrick's Day. Mm-hmm. And I just went through it and I cover this stuff. I follow this stuff, closely, but it took me even a while to recall some of these names, some of these, especially the black ones. I mean, as someone in the press who covers these issues, is there anything that, you think that's changed or any reason why? Is this that we're all talking about the president? Is it just, people are getting distracted? Because police brutality didn't just magically end.
I think that's the truth, right? Police brutality has not ended at all. But I also think that there's and nor have police killings stopped or ended, right? In fact, I think we're pacing maybe a dozen or two ahead of where we were this time last year, right? So in fact, year over year, police shootings are up. But what's happened, though, I think, is that much of our attention came from media focus. And the reality is that in this moment, so much of what we are focused on, what we are thinking about, what we are talking about is the President of the United States. And the President of the United States is not talking about these issues, and so therefore we are not either. We have to remember even last year. Last year was a year where we had Dallas, where we had Philando Castillo, where we had Keith Lamont Scott in Charlotte, and Seville Smith in Milwaukee. But for the first 6 months of the year, we basically didn't talk about police brutality or police killings at all. There's not a single name that trended in the first half of the year last year. Right. In fact, Alton Sterling is the first. And that happens in July, right? That so much of our attention was based solely on the presidential election, the primaries, the Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and Bernie, right? And that's so much of it. You still have activists, I'm talking to them now, who are still doing work in local levels. You still have some of the national activists who are involved in this work. But the reality is, right now, the focus is on Donald Trump. And so we're not paying attention to a lot of other things happening, and that's true on almost any policy issue, right? It's true in criminal justice. It's true sometimes on the environment. It's true on when there's not a imminent theoretical like immigration threat. We're not necessarily talking about that either. Like, our news cycle really ebbs and flows, and we have difficulty paying attention to things for long periods of time. We kind of pay attention while everyone's talking about it, and then we look away.
Ain't that the truth? I mean, but here's the thing: we can't really afford to stop paying attention to this during the Jeff Sessions era. And it's not just about Donald Trump; it's about Jeff Sessions and what he plans to do. Can you tell me a little bit about what he's done so far that, frankly, people should be paying attention to, especially when it comes to police violence?
Well, so there's there are a ton of things, right? And so the first is that, Jeff Sessions is just, he has often talked with an ideology very different than the Obama administration. That's probably to be expected, right? But he has kind of shown and stated that he does not think that these so-called patterns and practices investigations run by the Department of Justice, used extensively under the Obama administration, are things that they should continue doing. He's talked about how he thinks the Chicago report and the Ferguson report, both of which he says he did not read, But he talks about how he thinks both of them are just based on anecdotes, and they're not analytical, and so therefore they're unfair to police officers. And so what I think is very likely is that we're likely going to see a real drop-off in the willingness of the federal government to investigate police departments the way they have been. What we've also seen is a marked, kind of a marked distance and difference in what he states his goals and priorities are going to be. So right now, while we've had a Department of Justice that's talked a lot about commutations, it's talked a lot about kind of unwinding the drug war. What we're seeing now is Sessions talking a lot about how he thinks marijuana legalization has gotten out of control, right? Or he's talking a lot about wanting to crack down more on things like that.
Right, which seems like a recipe for me to increase mass incarceration. I mean, he's not going to bust some white kid in the village who's ordering weed online. He's going to be busting people who look like us.
Correct, in the streets, right? And it's going to get back to a disparate and inequitable enforcement that we've seen for decades, right? And so I think it's just a very interesting. It's just a very interesting time, and again, it's not a thing that's getting a ton of attention, in part because there's just so much going on, right? You have the fire hose that is the Trump administration. Every day is a new crisis. Every day is a new, drastically differing thing, in part because they handle things in a way that's not as traditional as many other administrations, and it creates a bit of a confusion every time, and it forces all of our eyeballs to the crisis of the day, which means that sometimes we can kind of lose sight of some of the other things going on.
I'm talking with Wesley Lowery, national reporter for the Washington Post and fellow Clevelander. And in that respect, I wanted to ask, what's going to happen, say, the consent decrees in these cities like ours? Cleveland police is operating under a consent decree with the Justice Department, mandating that it improve, that it get rid of its bias or what have you. I'm not sure how you do that. But the point is that they are basically contracted with the federal government to make sure that stuff like Tamir Rice and other, police killings do not happen anymore. How do you do that?
So, I think one of the things here is going to be important is that in this consent decree process, especially once the decree is in place, you have a local judge who's involved in the process, and I think that's going to be crucial and key in a lot of places, Cleveland specifically, right, where it's not just about the whims of the federal government, but that you do have some local accountability built into consent decree process. However, I do think that there's a real question, and something that I think a lot of us are eager to follow and figure out, is to what extent will the federal government not only stop launching these investigations proactively, but to what extent will they start unwinding either decrees that already exist or already in place, or to what extent will they basically look the other way and become apathetic to these agreements that are in place, right? Because again, the idea of these consent decrees is that the federal government has concluded you are systemically violating the civil rights of the people who live within your jurisdiction, and that they are deciding they're going to come in and force you to change that, right? When we have an attorney general who's basically said that he doesn't agree with these investigations and he thinks they're all anecdotal, that doesn't provide a lot of hope that he's going to continue enforcing them.
Yeah, it just feels like some Judge Dredd shit, you know what I mean? Where you have like, I am the law. I'm going to determine whatever the law is based upon my own particular predilections or, political priorities. And therefore, we're going to decide whether or not to enforce it. That just like how I don't know. I'm sighing because I'm frustrated, because I know that there's a whole swaths of America that are about to be ignored, by this Justice Department. I mean, you could see already some of the steps that they're taking to, defund environmental justice and all these other different things. But the point is, when it comes to police brutality specifically, we have a federal government that says Blue Lives Matter, literally.
Exactly, and it's just going to completely change, I think, the tenor and the tone of the conversation we've been having, right? And I think there is there's going to be an effect to that, right? While police really did not like the Obama administration, the rank and file officers did not like President Obama, did not like the stances he was taking or the things his Department of Justice were doing. What they knew was that he was paying attention to them, right? What many people would argue, many people in the civil rights community would argue, is that type of check and balance is extremely important, right? That local police have a lot of power, and so it's important that they know that the federal government is watching them and not just rubber stamping anything they want to do or anything they want to say, right? that when President Obama would step to the microphones or to a press conference after a big deal shooting, or high profile shooting, he would say, we need to respect the process, we need to respect our officers, and we want to keep them safe. But then he would also say we need to respect the First Amendment rights of protesters, right? He would say things like that, and with the message that sends to the local sheriff or the local police chief is that someone is watching, the federal government is watching, we're paying attention. Now, how will that be different the first time we have a high profile shooting or a whatever it is, and Donald Trump gets to the microphone and says, "Get all those thugs out of the street," right, or whatever it is he says, right? How will that empower the local powers that be to behave in ways that perhaps exacerbate these situations as opposed to rectify them?
Look at what he's already said about Chicago. Chicago, it's a different thing. He's talking there about urban violence, not police violence, but threatening to send the feds into Chicago. We don't know exactly what that means. What does it mean? Tanks or, National Guard troops? I don't exactly know how that's supposed to actually solve the problem as opposed to make people feel better. But that's what he's already threatening to do. So when, say, a police officer is killed or a police officer is, it's done, another Michael Brown happens or another Tamir Rice or Freddie Gray happens, what this administration does, I think, is going to be really telling. I mean, it's obviously we expect that they're going to, just side with the police, but it's about, I think, how vocally and how loudly they do it, and also how they use the powers of the government to, support that view.
Of course, exactly. And I just think there's a ton of questions here, right? And I think that again, as a journalist, I think there's a lot to be said for the power that the police have, right? And that the reality is, what we know from doing several years of this reporting is that there's just a lot of unchecked power, a lot of scrutiny that does not exist, right? There's not a ton of accountability. Part of that is because our local media has been so decimated by the economy going back a few decades. Part of it's also that, as Americans, we generally support the police. We can be very patriotic, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's this hesitancy sometimes to be critical of that institution. What that means is that you have a lot of officers, a lot of departments that basically get to do whatever they want. And I think it's important that we in the media continue to play that role, especially as it begins to appear as if the federal government may be less willing to play that role. Yeah.
I mean, we can talk a little bit also about writing about race and Black death and police violence as Black people. I mean, I don't know about you, but I mean, certainly the Tamir Rice case resonated, particularly harshly with me because of the fact that we're both from Cleveland. We're both kids who grew up, playing in parks like that. Maybe not with toy guns, but we, that scene is very familiar to us. And of course, now we see the only person that's been punished is this, announcement last week of an 8-day suspension for the 9/11 operator, Constance Hollinger, who violated protocol by failing to inform the officers that, the 9/11 caller had said that Tamir's weapon was probably fake and that he's probably a juvenile. She conveniently omitted that information, and we saw what happened. But it's really tough sometimes. I think it's particularly that case. You have a kid, literally a child, killed in such a fashion, and it's still years later. It's still very hard for me to even discuss it. It's amazing. I just want to know how you report about it because it's got to hit you.
It does. I think it does have to, and it does hit. There's the reality, right, that these are hard and painful stories to write about. That they involve death, they involve pain, they involve controversy, right? What we're often seeing is people who look like us, look like ourselves, not only being killed but then being villainized in the media and by my law enforcement very often. I just think that these are difficult stories, but I also think they're important stories, right? And they're important stories not just because not because reporting on them and telling them are necessarily going to make some type of huge difference today, right? Writing about this police shooting isn't what we know isn't necessarily going to get justice for the person or for their family, isn't necessarily going to change the outcome of the investigation, right? It isn't necessarily going to lead to any fewer police shootings, right? But what we know is that it's important, and I think it's extremely important to have an accurate historical record that tells us, what happened and what was happening in these moments. I just think that I think that matters, right? I think that a decade from now, a generation from now, it's going to be important that we can look back at this period of time and we have the most robust accountings of what was happening and what was not. And I think that's really important.
Wesley Lowry, appreciate you taking the time, brother. Thank you.
Anytime.
You're listening to With Friends Like These with Anna Marie Cox.
I'm Anna Marie Cox. I'll be honest with you. I never really got into shaving my legs. I used to say it's because I'm a feminist, and it's true, I am, but also I'm a little lazy. I just never got into it. So when I started buying razors for my husband on a regular basis, I was shocked at how much they cost, which is why I understand Harry's. Harry's was started by two guys, Jeff and Andy, who were fed up with being overcharged for razors. So they decided to start their own razor company to give guys everywhere what they deserve, a great shave at a fair price. They bought a factory with 100 years of blade making experience so they could make their own high-quality razors, sell them online, and ship them directly to you for half the price of the leading brand. Harry's razors include everything you need for a close, comfortable shave. They sent me a box for my husband, and I gotta say it's a really nice presentation. I tried to take credit for it as a present. It's 5 German-engineered blades, a lubricating strip, flex hinge for a comfortable glide, a trimmer blade for hard-to-reach places, and a weighted ergonomic handle. All of this for $2 a blade compared to the $4 or more you'll pay at a drugstore. Harry's is so confident in the quality of their blades, they want you to try their most popular trial set for free. It comes with a razor handle of your choice, a 5-blade cartridge, and saving gel, free when you sign up. Just pay a small fee for shipping. To redeem your free trial offer, go to harrys.com/friends right now. Again, that's harrys.com/friends.
Change is a funny thing when it requires politics to happen. We want it so fast, yet our system isn't really built for fast change. Our current president is running into those obstacles now, even though it doesn't really feel that way. I talked to my friend Jessica Bird, who I was introduced to years ago by our mutual friend Allison McQuaid. Jessica wears 2 really important hats. She leads a Washington, D.C. based political consulting firm called 3 Point Strategies, and she's the campaign director for Democracy in Color. I wanted to talk to her about what those entities do, and also how Michael Brown's killing sparked her to take this direction with her work. Okay, Jess, tell me what 3 Point Strategies does.
So 3 Point Strategies is actually 2 years old.
Congratulations.
Just this week.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And, we like to say that we work at the intersection of social justice and electoral politics. And so we really primarily live in 3 spaces, serving people of color communities and people of color candidates via training and hiring campaign managers to work on the campaigns of races we really love. We also provide candidate services to bold, visionary, progressive leaders. And then we kind of do this programmatic work, which is how I got connected to Democracy in Color, which is thinking about systemic change to open the path for more people to be involved in our democracy.
So basically, you're looking to get more people of color involved in politics, either electorally or just, I guess, in the movement, or just making sure people get out and vote, things like that. Okay.
Yes, much more succinct.
So one thing about 3 Point Strategies, you wrote a really interesting note on Medium the other day about your 2-year anniversary. And there's 2 very different things that I'm wondering about. And I just wanted to ask you, and how did Michael Brown's death change you? And how did it change your career?
It's such a good question. Well, it changed me personally. It changed everything. I've been, I would say, a politicized person for a long time. My mom was a poll worker for 30 years at the same polling location, and I literally grew up seeing her go to the polls and help people vote on election day. But I would say that I really took a very democratic route. I was raised and trained via Democratic Party in Ohio. My first races were for state house reps in the Ohio Democratic Caucus. I worked for Barack Obama. I was working at a large Democratic PAC, and so at the time, in August 9th, 2014. I really felt like I was contributing. I was going out, working on races. I was eating pizza all day long. I was writing campaign plans. But what that moment what the Ferguson uprising meant for me was really thinking about how electoral politics could mean transformative change, not just winning, but could actually help to transform our communities via public policy and via representative leadership. And so I started to ask myself really big questions, and I remember so distinctly just scrolling Twitter for days and days and days, and continuously seeing the photo of him laying in the middle of the street. And I just thought, if the only thing that I'm doing is beating Republicans, then that's not enough. That's just not enough. And so I really took a leap of faith. And what I will say is that the way that it has changed me politically, professionally, to the second part of your question, is that it has forced me to have a deeper understanding of public policy that truly loves Black people and governs in a way that people of color and our families can lead meaningful lives. And so that has meant not working with all Democrats. It has meant not working with progressive organizations who I believe are leading in inherently racist ways. It means calling out our friends on the left and saying, you didn't endorse in this race and because your process is racist. And so it has meant everything about the way that I approach my work and about the way that I also try to push from the inside.
Right. Now, that's actually one thing I wanted to ask you about, which is Democracy in Color focuses only on Democrats. It doesn't mess around with Republicans. It's not Republican color, and for a good reason. Why bother, with a party, frankly, that doesn't bother with us? But the focus on Democrat, is it better to, have that acute focus to hold Democrats to account?
Absolutely, right? I mean, part of the piece of this work is that it's not just the right thing to do to build not only a party, but a democratic process that's inclusive of all the people who live in our country. But it's also the winningest thing to do. In the last 50 years, we've had an incredible population explosion that has meant that the demographics of our country are just different. And while a lot of people talk about it, and they talk about how awesome that makes us, and that, truly we are a country at which we, could build this incredible tent where everyone can live in harmony, we actually have to then change our formulas at which we govern, change our formulas at which we lead campaigns, and change our formula at which we think about what people need in order to be included. And so what Democracy in Color really was a call to action to the Democratic Party to say, your formulas are outdated, and to be honest and take it a step further, your leaders are outdated. We need culturally competent staff willing to take a fresh look at the ways in which our population has changed and the ways in which voters are actually getting to our party. And we have to build the home that they deserve. And until we truly do that and build the home we deserve, we'll lose. And who is the most hurt when we lose and when we forfeit the opportunity to govern our communities? Well, it's people of color and folks who live at the margins. And so, Democracy in Color was this both and. It was, one, it's the right thing, so let's just do it. And two, we can't win unless we do. And our families need for us to win.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like Democrats have had, this moment of introspection forced upon them by the election of Donald Trump, and that, too much of the coverage, at least in the press, has been about what Democrats did wrong, not necessarily what certain Democrats have been doing right and weren't listened to. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's not like,
that's a great point.
You know what I mean? I feel like there's a lot of Democrats who have said, hey, Black women came out and voted for Hillary Clinton in force, and numbers went up in certain communities. And, there wasn't enough examination also of the effect of a Voting Rights Act that had been crippled by the Supreme Court, and the first presidential election in 50 years without that. So, I mean, when you see all of that introspection happening, especially through the press, what's your reaction as a political professional to how people are interpreting what the Democrats did wrong and what they're doing right?
I love this question.
I do my best.
I mean, the postmortems of this election are really, really frustrating. And one of the reasons is because it's complicated in that there's no one reason why Democrats lost at the national level. But what we do know is that there hasn't been an honest debrief also at the national level about what really happened. And that's particularly because we had these huge scandals, and rightfully so, like Russia hacking our elections, the DNC hack, the Comey letter. Like, those are really important factors in understanding the timeline and voters' reactions to a national election. But what we also, though, didn't spend a lot of time debriefing and talking about was the level of resources that were spent by the presidential and or national campaigns engaging voters of color specifically around issues that they care about. For the most part, the national election felt like a we're better than Donald Trump message.
Or like Donald Trump is so horrible that you really have no other choice and therefore vote for us. Is that what you're thinking?
Absolutely. And, I feel unafraid to say that I tried to sound the alarms so many times, and so many of my colleagues who are specifically working in this space did as well. I spent the spring and the summer leading a project called the Pathway Project, which was a little bit more of a quiet project, because I was training people of color-led, like, radical organizations to think about voter engagement, right? So to think about how mobilizing voters could also help them to base build for the issues that they care about when that time came. And I was talking to hundreds of young Black and brown people in cities and in battleground states. And in every single room that I was in, I felt this very scary lack of interest in the presidential election. And so I would come from those rooms and I would reach out to someone on the presidential, I would reach out to someone in the larger party, and I would say, like, it is frighteningly scary. And these are the questions that they're asking me. And so, like, let me tell you so that we can craft some messaging around it. And there was a literal refusal based on this idea that, like, how could anyone be questioning the Democratic presidential nominee when Trump exists? And it's like, well, that's not the right question. The right question is, how can we talk to our people? And so,
and that's the question the Democrats, it's amazing. The Black folks are by far, you would say, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, the most loyal constituency Democratic Party has.
Yes.
And you haven't figured out how to talk to them yet. Why is that? Someone at some point you would think that they would say, maybe it's us. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. I mean, part of what we're seeing right now as 45 rolls out his budget, or also as congressional Republicans show their willingness to really slash programs that we care about, is that people are saying your budget is a moral document, which I totally agree with. And I think that we can apply that to campaigns as well. Where did they spend their money? At what point did they spend their money? Did they put organizers in communities where they knew were Democratic, but who needed to talk specifically about the issues? Everything about a campaign demonstrates its values. And so if we were to ask for receipts on the timeline at which organizers were on the ground, at the level at which organizers were asked to engage with voters, and the resources that were spent specifically talking to those voters about the issues they cared about, I think that we would find our answer, which is that their budget didn't match the words that they were saying to us, which is that they cared about us when we really couldn't feel their presence.
I want to get back to this moment of change, because I think it ties into what we've been talking about here with, I guess, animating the Black voter, or talking to Black voters. We have the immediate rage that comes out of these flashpoint events, like Michael Brown's killing. It became political action immediately on the streets of Ferguson, but the political action as you know it is a long haul. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
right.
How do we, I'm just wondering how we reconcile the need for immediate results with the reality that politics takes a long time to make any kind of real change.
Well, if I figure this out, then I have found the key to the universe, and everything we need. I think part of starting 3-point strategies for me was to explore this question and was really to explore the intersection of our movement and the ballot box. And, I believe that I know that there are historical, social, cultural, systemic reasons why people are dismayed by our system. And so I am never in the business of convincing people that they should be a part of a system that doesn't value them. But what I know is also what happens when we engage in the system and the type of change that we can create. One of those examples, I think is Kim Foxx, who is the new Cook County District Attorney. I may have gotten that wrong.
Yeah. No.
But she, was really rallied around by Black activists in Chicago who were specifically organizing around the Buy Anita campaign about Anita Alvarez, who covered up the murder of Laquan McDonald. And one of the first things that she did this year after being inaugurated was to get rid of debtor jail policies, and said that people who have a bail of under $1,000 and under cannot be left in jail. And that saves our people. And I think that those examples of engaging in the system with an outcome is something that allows us to move our theory of change along. And so my ask is that, people not only engage because I do believe that it is an empowering and an exciting thing to do, but also because it has transformative effects on whether our people live or die, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's
and I did want to give another example, too. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. No, please.
Well, I just came freshly off of the St. Louis mayor's race, which was one of the most fun and motivating races that I've spent time on. But this was one of the first races, I would say first national races outside of the presidential since November, that people really started to question how movement and electoral politics were coming together. And what we know is that STL Vote was a coalition of activists who came out of the Ferguson uprising, who specifically mobilized around Tashara Jones, the city's treasurer, to run for office because they believed in her policies and because she really had been an advocate for them, even from the treasurer's office, which I know sounds rare. She came 888 votes from being the mayor of St. Louis. And more importantly, though, I mean, one, I feel 8,000 ways about why she lost, but is now engaging in an effort to do 365 civic engagement, using this example of the mayor's race and what was possible to also engage in other ways of accountability. And so that's just an example of what we can do when we think about electoral politics.
I'm really happy that I have friends who are really willing to get into this fight, because I feel like in my role as a journalist, my role is to observe and to tell stories about this. And, frankly, it looks really, really hopeless at a lot of times. You know what I mean? And especially when you have a president who's elected who, does the things that he does. But even he is learning that politics takes a long time to change things. I mean, yes, he's issuing travel bans, for Muslims and, that are getting rejected by courts and, whatnot. And he's finding out that there are actually some obstacles out here to stop him from just doing whatever the hell he feels like doing. And I think that, there is something we can take away from that change takes time. And it's not just movement politics, it's actual politics.
Absolutely. Well, so, I mean, I agree with you. And, an important reflection for me has been that I was doing this work at the down ballot, specifically with communities of color, for years before I could even fathom that a Donald Trump would exist. And it has been important to me in this time where everyone is trying to figure out how to both resist but also how to contribute to what's needed now, that I remember that my work started before he and his incompetence, and it will last and be needed long after. And for me, down ballot local elections have always been where change happens. You know, I've been working on mayor's races for the last several months. You know, your mayor oversees your budget, which includes housing policy, which includes policing and whether your police force is expanded, and your city council oversees the type of zoning that you have in your city. And we know that largely people of color communities are living inside cities. And so I have always drawn my inspiration from the way that people wake up in the morning and will go to an office and be really thoughtful and innovative about the way to keep people employed and to bring new tech and to expand public transportation. And so I encourage anyone who's even listening right now to Google who some of your elected representatives are, especially if you're living in a major city. They're the folks who are going to be the shield between you and the federal government. And so we need to either support them or get the right ones in office right away.
Indeed. What I want to also just close with is just, we're both from Ohio. We both, have a lot of pride in being from Ohio. And
yes.
I-O, duh. And what I wanted to ask you is, starting out in this state and what did you learn from your time here? What do you feel like America can learn about what Ohio is? You know, you have Cleveland, you have Columbus, you have Cincinnati, you have these three very concentrated Democratic constituencies, and then you have the rest of the state, essentially.
Absolutely. I love Ohio.
Yes, we love it. But do we understand it? That's the question.
No, I don't think we do. Ohio is such a microcosm of this future that we so badly are trying to figure out, which is how to include all of us in a governance platform or in our parties. One of the things about growing up in Ohio is that, I went to predominantly black high schools. I lived in a working poor neighborhood and knew very much so that our state was diverse, not just racially, but specifically economically, and that there were a lot of different trades going on around me, right? So like I learned in high school about what it meant to be a farmer in the state of Ohio, while also understanding that I lived in like a metropolitan city where 50,000 college students were going, and that there were very specific policies that meant that young people should be staying in our city. And so it helped me as an organizer to be thoughtful about the reasons why people come to any political table. What it also did, and one of the reasons why there are so many of us in politics, is that every 4 years there's a huge amount of spotlight on Ohio and the way that we're organizing, and I would even say a huge amount of resources that are spent on engaging Ohio voters. And so I really was trained to think bigger and to think about my impact in a way that wasn't just local, but that could potentially be the tip of the spear in national politics. And even if you aren't blessed and from Ohio, I do hope that you think about yourself inside this puzzle of the ways in which, your vote or your engagement in the system really could swing a national culture change in our politics. And I just want to give a shout out to my brothers, Peter and David, who are still in Ohio.
Yes, they're still here and presumably okay.
Yes. They're perfect, actually. No, I'm kidding.
Well, Jess, it was really good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
All right. That's all for this week. Special thanks to Dave Woodward of Childers Media, who opened his doors to me here in Lima, Ohio, and helped us get this podcast recorded. Anna will be back hosting with Friends Like These next week. Until then, I hope that you keep having some difficult conversations of your own.